Picture a Roman battlefield just after the clash of steel has ended. The roar of soldiers, the thunder of hooves, the clash of sword against shield, gone. What remains is silence, broken only by the wind carrying the stench of blood and sweat. The earth itself has turned dark red, littered with broken spears, shattered armor, and the lifeless bodies of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men. For most, this would be nothing less than hell on earth, a place where hope had been swallowed by carnage. But for Rome, this was not chaos. It was the beginning of something else. To the Romans, even death had to follow rules. Where others saw ruin, they saw procedure. Where others recoiled in horror, they imposed order. The battlefield was not abandoned to decay, it was transformed, step by step, by a disciplined machine that refused to leave anything unfinished. The wounded were searched for and saved, not only out of compassion, but because every soldier was a resource for the empire's future wars. The dead were identified, recorded, and buried, because to be forgotten was considered a greater disgrace than death itself. Weapons were collected, repaired, or reforged. Even enemy arms could find new life in Roman hands. And over it all loomed ritual, purification, sacrifice, and the final spectacle of triumph, turning slaughter into divine justice. For Rome, war never ended when the swords fell silent. It continued in the meticulous aftermath, in the rituals, the records, the monuments. This was the true secret of Roman power, not just victory in battle, but mastery over everything that came after. The moment the battle ended was not defined by cheering or celebration. It was defined by silence. The Roman legions, who only hours before had marched in perfect formation, shields locked and swords flashing, now stood scattered across a landscape that looked more like a vision of the underworld than the earth of men. The clash of steel had ceased, the war cries had faded, and the battlefield had been transformed into a vast open graveyard. Corpses lay everywhere, sprawled across the dirt in grotesque positions. Some still clutched their weapons as though death had frozen them mid-strike. Others lay face down in pools of blood, their armor dented, their shields split. The acrid smell of sweat, iron, and smoke hung in the air, mingling with the stench of death that always arrived faster than the living wished to admit. Broken spears jutted from the ground like wooden tombstones. Horses, too, had fallen, their lifeless bodies tangled in the leather straps of their harnesses. To an outsider, say, a barbarian tribe stumbling upon this scene, it would have looked like the end of the world. Nothing but carnage, despair, and decay. But the Romans did not see it this way. They saw not chaos, but the beginning of another phase of war. Because for Rome, victory was incomplete until order had been imposed upon death itself. The first command that rang out from the surviving officers was not, celebrate, or rest. It was an order to search. Teams of legionaries moved slowly through the aftermath, their eyes trained not on the dead, but on the faintest signs of life. They listened for groans hidden under the weight of fallen comrades. They watched for the twitch of a hand, the rise and fall of a chest that hadn't yet gone still. This was not done purely out of compassion. In Rome's cold calculation, every soldier saved meant a soldier ready for the next campaign. War was not a single clash, but a chain of conflict stretching across years, even decades. A man preserved today might swing his sword in Gaul tomorrow, or in Judea the year after that. Rome's machine could not afford to waste human resources any more than it could waste metal or coin. Those who were only lightly wounded were treated on the spot. Military physicians, known as medici, carried small satchels of tools, bandages, and herbal mixtures. Their work was rough by modern standards, cauterizing wounds with heated iron, stitching gashes with crude thread, but it was enough to keep men alive. The more serious cases were rushed to La Truncularia, mobile field hospitals set up within marching distance of the battle. These were crude tents or hastily built wooden huts, but inside them the work was urgent and relentless. Men screamed as limbs were amputated to stop infection. Some survived, scarred but still part of Rome's war machine. Many lingered for days before succumbing. Still, the effort mattered, because each life spared was another weapon in Rome's arsenal. Meanwhile, centurions and record-keepers began their grim duty, identifying the dead. Every legionary carried a small lead tag called a signaculum. It was no larger than a coin, yet it held his entire identity, his name, his unit, his hometown. To lose one's life was expected. To lose one's name was intolerable. For Rome, the duty of recording the fallen went beyond bureaucracy. It was a promise that no soldier would vanish into anonymity. Families back home could grieve with dignity, knowing their sons had been recognized, their sacrifice acknowledged. The process was methodical. Bodies were turned over, their tags read, their names etched onto wax tablets. Officers made sure the lists were accurate. It was not just about numbers for the Senate's reports, it was about memory, about ensuring that service to Rome was never erased. In the Roman worldview, dying for the Republic, or later, the Empire, was an honorable duty. But being forgotten was a disgrace worse than death itself. Once the wounded had been pulled from the field and the dead recorded, attention turned to burial. The Romans believed deeply that the soul could not rest if the body was left exposed. A corpse abandoned to rot under the sun was not just a sanitary risk, it was a spiritual disaster. To die unburied meant to wander restlessly in the afterlife. Even in the thick of war, soldiers understood this, and so they dug mass graves or built funeral pyres as soon as possible. There was also a collective insurance system among soldiers known as the collegia funeratia. Each man contributed a small portion of his pay into a shared fund, guaranteeing that if he fell in battle, his comrades would ensure a proper burial. It was both practical and symbolic. A soldier's final dignity was secured not only by the state but by the brotherhood of the legion. No one would be left behind. At the very least, even the humblest legionary could expect a simple stone inscription marking his name, proof that he had lived and died in service to Rome. But equality ended where rank began. Officers and commanders received far more elaborate honors. When a respected centurion fell, his men might pool their resources to erect a memorial tomb. On rare occasions, emperors themselves ordered vast monuments built, inscribed with thousands of names, transforming grief into glory. These memorials were more than graves. They were propaganda, living stone reminders that Rome valued sacrifice and immortalized valor. At the same time, practical concerns pressed in. Decomposition began almost immediately, threatening to spread disease not just to soldiers but to civilians who might later pass through the area. This was where Rome's engineers, the Fabri, took center stage. Their work was less glamorous than battle, but just as critical. They surveyed the land, removed corpses, dismantled temporary fortifications, and disinfected the soil. Sometimes lime was scattered across blood-soaked ground to hasten decomposition and neutralize infection. The Fabri's labor was invisible in the annals of glory, yet without it, entire legions might have been wiped out by plague rather than swords. As the sun set over battlefields littered with death, Rome's soldiers and engineers worked tirelessly. What had begun as chaos slowly transformed into something else: order, ritual, and memory. To the Romans, this was not just cleanup. It was the continuation of war by other means. War did not end when the enemy's last warrior fell. It ended only when Rome had imposed its structure on every detail of the aftermath, on the living, the dead, the land, and even the air itself. And so, as fires burned on hastily built funeral pyres and wax tablets filled with the names of the fallen, the legions marched into the next stage of conflict. Not against flesh and blood, but against chaos itself. And like always, Rome intended to emerge victorious. When the living had been pulled from the wreckage of battle and the wounded carried to makeshift tents, the Romans turned their eyes to those who would never rise again. For them, burial was not simply a sanitary act, nor a token of respect, it was a sacred duty, one of the most important obligations in the aftermath of war. The Romans believed that the soul of the dead could never find peace if the body was left exposed to the elements. To die unburied was to wander restlessly, denied entry into the world of the ancestors. It was not just a matter of personal dignity, it was a threat to cosmic order. Even amid carnage, even in hostile territory, soldiers understood that to abandon their comrades was unthinkable. And so, when the swords fell silent, the shovels began to dig. On fields where thousands had perished, it was impossible to grant each man an individual grave. Instead, trenches were dug, wide and deep, to hold rows of bodies. Soldiers worked in silence, lifting corpses with care, arranging them side by side. When wood was plentiful, funeral pyres were built, massive stacks of timber set ablaze to carry the fallen into smoke and ash. In both cases, the ritual was the same: words of farewell, sometimes a brief prayer, and always the assurance that the dead were not forgotten. For the rank-and-file legionary, this promise was more than symbolic. Each man contributed a portion of his pay to a collective fund known as the Collegia Funeratia. It was, in essence, a burial insurance. If a soldier fell, his brothers-in-arms guaranteed that his body would be cared for, that his grave would be marked, even if only with a small stone bearing his name. This system reflected Rome's relentless practicality, but it also reflected something deeper: solidarity. The legion was a family, bound not only by oaths of service but by shared responsibility in death. Imagine a soldier, anonymous to us now, but once a living man from a village in Campania or Hispania, lying lifeless in the dirt. His signaculum identifies him, his name etched on wax and later carved into stone. His burial paid for not by strangers, but by the very comrades who had marched beside him, eaten beside him, and fought beside him. In Rome's logic, no man was ever allowed to disappear into nameless decay. Yet burial also revealed the harsh reality of hierarchy. The ordinary soldier might be laid in a trench, his name recorded and his grave marked with little more than a rough inscription. But officers, centurions, and especially commanders were honored in ways that ordinary men could never imagine. When a centurion died, his men sometimes pooled their resources to build a tomb, a monument that stood as both remembrance and propaganda. Inscriptions celebrated his bravery, his loyalty, and the devotion of the soldiers who had followed him. These memorials weren't merely gestures of affection, they were deliberate statements that Rome rewarded those who commanded with valor. In extraordinary cases, emperors and generals themselves raised massive monuments. One striking example came under Emperor Trajan. In modern-day Romania, at a site called Adamclisi, a huge memorial was constructed inscribed with the names of thousands of soldiers who had died in his campaigns. This was not just a grave, it was a permanent engraving of sacrifice onto the landscape. To Rome, stone was memory. Through it, grief was transformed into glory. The burial of the dead carried immense spiritual weight. The Romans were deeply religious, and they believed that war was never a purely human affair, it was bound up with the will of the gods. To leave bodies unburied was to risk angering those gods, to risk polluting not only the army but Rome itself. Corpses left to rot invited not only disease but divine disfavor. That is why even in desperate conditions, Roman commanders insisted on burial. Soldiers carried spades along with their swords, prepared to dig graves as surely as they were prepared to fight. The act of covering the dead was as much a part of military discipline as standing in formation or raising a shield. The act of burial also served Rome's political and psychological goals. For soldiers, laying their comrades to rest reinforced loyalty. It reminded them that they were part of something larger, that their service would not vanish into obscurity. For families back home, the news that their sons had been buried properly offered a kind of grim comfort. They could mourn knowing their sacrifice had been acknowledged. And for enemies, burial, or the denial of it, sent powerful messages. When Rome chose to bury its foes, it was an act of magnanimity, a show of superiority cloaked in mercy. But when Rome refused burial, when it left enemy corpses to rot, it was a calculated display of dominance, a warning carved in flesh and bone: resist Rome, and you will not even be granted peace in death. One can imagine the thoughts of a legionary before battle, gripping his sword, staring across the field at the enemy line. He knew he might die within the hour. But he also knew that if he fell, his name would be read, his tag would be noted, and his body would be carried to a grave or a pyre. He would not be left to rot like an animal. His brothers would see to it. His family would one day receive word, not of his survival, but of his dignity. This assurance, grim though it was, gave soldiers a strange kind of comfort. Death was inevitable, but dishonor was not. And in Rome, that distinction mattered. Burial rituals were more than acts of closure. They were Rome's way of binding the individual to the collective memory of the state. Every grave, every inscription, every name carved in stone was a building block in the story of the empire. Rome did not allow death to scatter its soldiers into oblivion. It gathered them, recorded them, and laid them into the soil of history. This, more than anything else, reveals the Roman mind. For them, war was not chaos. It was order, imposed even over death. And the grave was not an end, but a continuation of loyalty, discipline, and Roman identity. As the funeral pyres crackled into the night sky, as smoke mingled with the stars, the legions knew they were not merely disposing of bodies. They were performing the highest duty a soldier could offer to his comrades, to ensure that even in death, Rome's order triumphed over chaos. As the trenches filled and the pyres burned, the legions were reminded of a truth that stretched beyond life itself. In Rome, not all deaths were equal. Every soldier was honored, yes, but honor came in layers, divided by rank, reputation, and the eyes of history. For the common legionary, burial meant a trench shared with dozens of comrades, his body wrapped hastily, his belongings either returned to the quartermasters or taken as spoils by fellow soldiers. His name, etched onto wax tablets, would one day find its way into stone inscriptions or records. Perhaps a rough marker would stand above his grave, little more than a carved slab of limestone. He was remembered, but faintly, as one among thousands. Yet to his family back home, that faint memory mattered. A message might eventually reach his village in Latium or a farmstead in Hispania: their son had fallen, his name preserved, his soul at rest. This modest recognition was his shield against eternal anonymity. But when an officer died, the response was far different. A centurion, for example, held not only authority in battle but also symbolic weight in the structure of the legion. His fall could not pass quietly. His men often banded together, contributing their own wages to build a tomb or memorial. Such a monument might stand at the edge of a battlefield or along a Roman road, carved with inscriptions praising his loyalty, courage, and the devotion of his soldiers. These markers served two purposes: they gave the centurion a form of immortality, and they reminded those who passed by that Rome valued not only obedience but leadership. The higher the rank, the greater the honors. Commanders, generals, and men of senatorial status often received elaborate funeral rites. Their bodies might be carried away from the battlefield entirely, returned to Rome or to ancestral estates. Processions were organized, attended by soldiers, officers, and officials. Inscriptions praised their victories, sculpted reliefs depicted their deeds, and altars were raised to ensure their names would echo through generations. Death for such men was not merely an end. It was a transformation into legend. One of the most striking examples came during the reign of Emperor Trajan. After his campaigns in Dacia, in what is now modern-day Romania, he ordered the construction of a colossal memorial at Adenclysi. On its vast surface were inscribed the names of thousands of soldiers who had fallen in service. It was not just a monument, it was a declaration that sacrifice for Rome was eternal. The dead were not simply buried, they were woven into the very stone of the empire. This hierarchy of remembrance reflected Rome's broader worldview. The empire was built on discipline, structure, and order, and death itself was no exception. Each layer of society, from the lowliest legionary to the most decorated general, was placed within a system of honors and memory. For the ordinary man, it was enough to be named, to avoid the disgrace of being forgotten. For the elite, death was an opportunity to demonstrate to the world that leadership carried not only power in life, but prestige in death. The duality was clear: the soldier's comfort was that he would not vanish, while the commander's privilege was that he would be immortalized. Together, these practices created a web of remembrance that bound the army tightly to the state. A legionary could march into battle knowing that his name, however humble, would not disappear into dust. A commander could lead knowing that his glory would not end on the battlefield but continue in monuments, inscriptions, and the voices of poets. There was also a political dimension. Rome understood that how its dead were treated shaped the morale of the living. If common soldiers were neglected, resentment could fester. If leaders were not celebrated, loyalty to authority might waver. By ensuring that every man was recognized, and that leaders were elevated, Rome reinforced both unity and hierarchy at once. The soldier felt secure in his brotherhood, and the officer knew his service would be remembered with grandeur. Both were tied more firmly to the empire's cause. In some cases, the honors extended beyond the individual to entire units. Standards, or signa, carried by legions were sacred symbols. When a unit suffered devastating losses, the standard itself was often enshrined or dedicated to the gods. In this way, the memory of the fallen became inseparable from the identity of the legion. The men might be gone, but their standard continued, carrying their spirit forward. This practice further cemented the idea that death was not an ending but a transformation, a folding of individual sacrifice into the greater story of Rome. And still, beyond the grand tombs and massive monuments, the simple truth endured: Rome did not allow its soldiers to vanish. Even the smallest gravestone, carved with the briefest of inscriptions, carried meaning. A line etched in stone might read, "Here lies Marcus, son of Lucius, soldier of the 10th Legion." Nothing more, nothing less. But that single line was proof of existence, a shield against oblivion, a promise kept. The sight of funeral pyres lighting up the night sky, the smoke carrying the dead into the heavens, the trenches lined with bodies covered in earth, all of it was Rome's way of saying, order has been restored. Death had been organized, classified, and honored according to the empire's code. Where others saw chaos, Rome saw structure. Where others saw loss, Rome saw continuity. For the soldiers who remained, watching the flames rise or standing silently as comrades lowered bodies into the earth, the rituals offered reassurance. They reminded every man that while his body might one day lie among those ashes, his name would not vanish. His service would not be erased. Rome would remember. That certainty, grim as it was, gave the legion its steel resolve. And for the generals and commanders, the prospect of posthumous glory added another layer of ambition. Victories in life brought power and wealth, but the assurance of monuments, altars, and eternal praise gave them reason to push further, to claim risks that might one day secure them a place in stone. In this way, death was not merely endured, it was harnessed, transformed into fuel for the living and inspiration for future campaigns. Thus, even in death, the Roman hierarchy persisted. The common soldier rested with the comfort of being named, while the commander soared into legend. Together, they created a tapestry of memory that stretched across the empire, binding battlefield soil to marble monuments, ashes to inscriptions, grief to glory. Rome did not simply bury its dead. It wove them into its story, ensuring that their sacrifice, great or small, fed the eternal flame of the empire. Once the graves were filled and the tombs erected, a different kind of army stepped forward. They were not legionaries carrying swords, nor centurions barking commands. They were the Fabri, the engineers, craftsmen, and builders of Rome. Their weapons were shovels, saws, lime, and fire. Their battlefield was no longer filled with enemies, but with rot, infection, and the creeping hand of decay. If soldiers had fought to win the battle, the Fabri fought to preserve its aftermath. The Romans understood something that many civilizations ignored, that victory could mean nothing if disease followed in its wake. A rotting corpse could spread plague faster than any sword. Pools of stagnant blood could turn into breeding grounds for illness. The stench alone, if left unchecked, could corrode morale. And so, the Fabri went to work with the same discipline the legionaries had shown in combat. First came the removal of what remained. Corpses of men and animals that had not yet been buried were hauled away. Horses, oxen, and mules that had collapsed in the frenzy of battle were dragged into pits or set alight on pyres. Carcasses were treated not as refuse but as hazards, each one a potential spark for catastrophe. Soldiers assisted in this grisly work, but the Fabri directed it, their eyes trained to see danger where others saw only wreckage. Next, the temporary fortifications of war were dismantled. The trenches that once shielded men from arrows now collected stagnant water, festering with blood. Barricades of wood and stone that had blocked the enemy's advance became nests for vermin. The Fabri tore them down, filled the ditches, and smoothed the ground. What was once a killing field slowly took the shape of clean earth again. Blood-soaked soil presented its own dangers. Roman engineers had a simple but effective remedy: lime. Scattered across dark patches of ground, lime hastened decomposition and neutralized odors. To the modern eye, this might seem primitive, but in its time it was cutting-edge sanitation. The Romans were not simply cleaning for appearances. They were purifying, protecting their army from invisible enemies that could strike harder than barbarians ever could. The Fabri also repaired infrastructure wherever they marched. Roads churned by horses and siege engines were leveled. Wooden bridges hastily built for crossing rivers were torn down or strengthened, depending on whether the army would return. Wells and streams near the battlefield were tested, sometimes purified with ash or guarded to prevent contamination. These were not luxuries, they were necessities. A poisoned water source could kill more soldiers than an enemy ambush. The thoroughness was staggering. Every spearhead, every shield, every fragment of armor was collected. If a weapon could be salvaged, it was sent to the blacksmiths. If it was broken beyond repair, it was melted down. Iron and bronze were far too valuable to waste, especially when soaked in the blood of victory. In Rome's logic, even the metal of the fallen enemy could be reborn as Roman strength. A sword that once threatened a legionary could be reforged into a plow for Roman fields or into nails for a Roman fortress. Nothing was discarded. It was not uncommon for captured enemy standards or weapons of exceptional craftsmanship to be preserved and dedicated to the gods. In temples to Mars, Jupiter, or Victory, these relics became trophies, testaments that even the strength of Rome's foes had been absorbed into the empire. In some cases, these materials were deliberately incorporated into monuments. By embedding enemy arms into Roman stone, engineers symbolically transformed foreign power into Roman triumph. But the Fabri's work was not celebrated. Unlike generals who rode in triumphal processions or soldiers who received decorations, the engineers remained nameless in history. They were shadows, working at night under torchlight, their faces smeared with soot and sweat. Yet without them, Rome's victories could collapse into disaster. Their labor kept armies moving, kept disease at bay, and ensured that the empire's image of order was never compromised. Imagine a battlefield 2 days after combat. The smoke of funeral pyres still hangs in the air. The ground is blackened with dried blood. And yet, in the distance, you see men in orderly rows, shoveling earth, scattering lime, dragging wreckage into piles. Where others would leave ruin, Rome is already rebuilding. Step by step, they erase chaos. Step by step, they turn a place of horror into a stage for empire. The soldiers who remained alive drew a strange comfort from this. To see comrades buried, the ground purified, and the equipment collected was proof that Rome never abandoned its own, nor left a place untamed. The empire did not simply win battles, it mastered what battles left behind. For the legionary still standing, this discipline reinforced his loyalty. He could trust that no matter how far from home he marched, Rome's order would always follow. The Fabri's quiet war against decay also carried a symbolic message. It showed that Rome could control not only the living and the dead, but also the land itself. They imposed civilization where others saw wilderness. They turned battlefields into order, just as they turned provinces into colonies, and colonies into extensions of the empire. This was Rome's identity, never to leave chaos unchallenged, never to allow disorder to endure. What makes this even more remarkable is the sheer scale of documentation. As engineers cleared and repaired, scribes recorded the number of bodies removed, the amount of lime scattered, the weapons recovered, all of it was listed, catalogued, and eventually etched into tablets or inscriptions. Even the grim work of cleansing did not escape Rome's obsession with record-keeping. It was not enough to do the work, it had to be remembered, preserved, and woven into the empire's story. The battlefield, once a place of screams and bloodshed, became a ledger. Every corpse accounted for, every weapon reassigned, every trench filled. This was not merely logistics. It was ideology. Rome defined itself through control, and the battlefield was its canvas. Even death, with all its unpredictability and stench, was forced into lines and columns, into order and memory. For outsiders, this discipline was terrifying. Imagine being a defeated foe, watching from a distance as the Romans, after slaughtering your kin, calmly organized their remains, purified the earth, and marched on as if nothing had happened. It was not savagery. It was worse, it was order wielded like a weapon. Rome showed that nothing escaped its grasp, not even decay. And so, when the Fabri finished their work, when the fires died down and the ground was leveled, the battlefield was no longer a place of death. It was Rome's monument to itself. A site of carnage transformed into a testament of discipline. A place where chaos had been conquered twice, once by sword, and once by shovel. When the last Roman soldier was buried and the smoke from funeral pyres drifted skyward, one question still lingered over every battlefield: what should be done with the enemy dead? For the legions, their own fallen were sacred. They were recorded, buried, remembered. But the bodies of their enemies, those who had raised steel against Rome, posed a different challenge. How the Romans chose to handle them depended not only on circumstance but also on politics, strategy, and symbolism. There was no single rule. Instead, treatment of enemy corpses shifted like the tides of war, shaped by who the enemy was and what message Rome wished to send. Against honorable foes, established states such as Carthage, Macedonia, or the organized tribes of Gaul, the Romans sometimes extended a grim kind of respect. Their dead were buried, sometimes even allowed to be retrieved by surviving comrades. These gestures were framed as magnanimity, mercy granted by the victors. But behind the surface of mercy lay calculation. By burying a noble adversary, Rome elevated itself. It portrayed itself as a civilized empire, disciplined enough to honor an enemy even in death. This was not kindness for kindness' sake, it was theater, carefully staged to win allies, impress rivals, and reinforce the idea that Rome stood above barbarity. At times, Roman soldiers themselves carried out the burials, setting enemy bodies into the earth with the same methodical care they gave their own fallen. To the families of those foes, it was an unexpected dignity. To Rome, it was a demonstration: we hold the power of life and death, and even your dead belong to us. Magnanimity could be weaponized just as much as cruelty. But this respect was never guaranteed. When the enemy was deemed dishonorable, rebellious, or barbaric, mercy vanished. Rebellious slaves, for instance, were often denied burial. Their bodies were left to bake under the sun, food for scavenging birds and beasts. It was not carelessness, it was deliberate punishment, a warning that treachery against Rome stripped a man not only of his life but also of his dignity in death. To be left unburied was to suffer the ultimate dishonor, one that extended beyond the grave into the spiritual realm. The same fate often awaited tribal groups who resisted Romanization. To the empire, these peoples were not worthy of the rites of burial. Their corpses were abandoned, their decay a silent proclamation that defiance meant obliteration, not only in life but in memory. For survivors who looked upon the rotting remains of their kin, the message was unmistakable: Rome does not forgive rebellion. Submit, or your bones will bleach under the open sky. The treatment of enemy leaders could be even more brutal. Their corpses were sometimes mutilated, their heads severed and displayed. It was not uncommon for severed heads to be paraded through Roman streets or mounted in public spaces such as the Forum. These grisly trophies served as both proof of victory and instruments of psychological warfare. Citizens could see with their own eyes the physical remains of those who had dared oppose the empire. Generals basked in the prestige such displays afforded, their authority reinforced by the visible humiliation of their enemies. For the Romans, this was not random savagery. It was ritualized punishment. By desecrating the bodies of rebel leaders, they enacted symbolic justice, turning the corpse into a canvas upon which Rome painted its dominance. Even in death, the enemy served the empire's purpose. There were other uses for enemy remains as well. Occasionally, corpses were burned not as a funeral rite but as a sanitary measure, the ashes scattered without prayer or dignity. In some cases, the bodies were piled as crude markers, left to rot in view of nearby settlements. These heaps of decay were less about disposal than intimidation. They were wordless but unmistakable. This is what happens when you defy Rome. To the modern eye, such actions seem merciless. But to the Romans, they were entirely consistent with their worldview. Order had to be imposed. Chaos, whether in life or in death, was a threat to the empire's stability. By controlling how enemy corpses were handled, Rome controlled not only the battlefield but also the narrative of the war. Every decision, whether to bury, burn, display, or abandon, was calculated. Nothing was left to chance. Even mercy carried a sting of propaganda. When Rome allowed enemy dead to be buried with dignity, it was never out of weakness. It was framed as strength, as proof that Rome could afford generosity because it had total control. When Carthaginian or Macedonian soldiers were laid to rest by Roman hands, it was less about honoring them and more about showcasing Rome's superiority. "We decide your fate, even after death," the empire seemed to say. And when Rome chose cruelty, it was equally deliberate. A rotting corpse was more than waste, it was a warning sign etched into the landscape. Generals understood that terror could be as effective as the sword. The stench of unburied bodies drifting into enemy lands, the sight of heads mounted on pikes, these were messages no ambassador needed to translate. They spoke in the universal language of fear. The impact of these practices was profound. For Rome's allies, they reinforced loyalty. To be allied with Rome was to know your fallen would be treated with dignity. For enemies, they instilled dread. To resist Rome was to risk not only defeat but humiliation that stretched beyond the grave. For soldiers within the legions, they underscored the value of their service. A Roman legionary knew he would not be abandoned, that he would be given rights denied to Rome's enemies. That distinction, between those who were remembered and those who were erased, strengthened the bond between soldier and state. It is tempting to think of war as ending when the last sword falls. But for Rome, war continued in the handling of the dead. The burial of their own was an act of brotherhood. The treatment of their enemies was an act of politics, religion, and propaganda. Each body, Roman or foreign, became part of a larger story. Some were woven into the empire's memory. Others were left to vanish into dust, erased not only from life but from legacy. Standing on such a battlefield, one would have seen two fates unfolding side by side. On one side, Roman soldiers digging graves, inscribing names, setting fire to pyres that glowed against the evening sky. On the other, the bodies of enemies lying abandoned, stripped of armor, their faces already being picked apart by scavenger birds. The contrast was stark, deliberate, and unforgettable. It was the visual language of empire, the brutal theater of dominance. In the end, even the enemy dead became part of Rome's arsenal. They were used to terrify, to inspire, to elevate, or to degrade. Death did not remove them from the game, it placed them into Rome's hands as instruments of order, symbols of power, and warnings carved in flesh. For Rome, war was not just about victory on the battlefield. It was about controlling every consequence of that victory, even the silence of the grave. When the graves were sealed and the last funeral pyres burned down to ash, Rome's work was not finished. To the Roman mind, the battlefield was not only a place of blood and soil, it was a place of spiritual danger. Every corpse, every drop of blood, every scream cut short carried with it a weight that could not be measured in wounds or numbers. It carried pollution, a stain upon the living, a shadow that might cling to soldiers and follow them back into the heart of the empire. The Romans called this taint religio, not in the sense of organized worship, but in the sense of taboo, of spiritual imbalance. They believed that death released forces that could unsettle both men and gods if not carefully controlled. To march from a battlefield back into Rome without proper cleansing was unthinkable. It risked not only the health of the soldiers but the prosperity of the state itself. And so, the legions turned to ritual. At the center of this ritual stood the lustratio, a solemn act of purification. Once the dead had been dealt with, the army gathered in formation, no longer to fight but to cleanse. Priests, or pontifices, accompanied by military officials, moved among the ranks. Animals were led forward, white bulls, rams, or pigs, chosen not for their meat but for their symbolic purity. Fires were lit, incense burned, and prayers were recited in the cadence of tradition, each word binding the soldiers not only to one another but to the gods who watched from above. One by one, the sacrifices were made. The animals' throats were cut, the blood spilled deliberately onto the earth, mingling with the blood of the fallen. To modern eyes it may seem barbaric, but to Rome, it was balance, life given to counter the lives taken. The carcasses were burned, their smoke rising to the heavens, carrying with it the plea for forgiveness and favor. The air, heavy with ash and incense, became a bridge between mortal men and immortal deities. The soldiers themselves were part of the ritual. They were sprinkled with water mixed with ash and herbs, symbolic cleansing meant to wash away the stain of bloodshed. Some ceremonies included passing the troops between fires, the flames believed to burn away unseen pollution. The act was not merely symbolic, it was believed to be essential. Without it, men carried a spiritual sickness, one that could spread like plague, corrupting not only the army but the city of Rome itself. These rites were as much about morale as they were about faith. For the legionary who had watched friends fall and enemies rot in the sun, purification offered a form of closure. It told him that the gods had been appeased, that he was not cursed, that he could march forward without fear of divine wrath. In the collective silence of the ritual, as prayers rose and fires crackled, men who had been hardened by slaughter found reassurance. They were no longer tainted killers, they were once again soldiers of Rome, sanctified by ritual, cleansed by the favor of the gods. Commanders understood the power of these ceremonies. A general who neglected purification risked more than the anger of heaven. He risked the loyalty and discipline of his men. If soldiers believed themselves spiritually polluted, they might lose confidence, see omens in every storm, misfortune in every delay. The army was not just a machine of flesh and iron, it was a community bound by belief. Without ritual, cracks could form. With ritual, the army marched forward as one body, certain that Jupiter, Mars, and the spirits of Rome approved. Purification also had political weight. Reports of the lustratio were often sent back to Rome alongside the tallies of dead and captured. They reassured the Senate and the people that the victory was not cursed, that the spoils of war were not tainted. The rituals reminded everyone that conquest was not merely the work of men but the will of the gods. When priests declared the army cleansed, it was as though divine sanction had been stamped upon the campaign. The rituals extended beyond the army itself. Often, trophies and spoils were dedicated in temples, offerings to Mars, Jupiter, or victory. Captured weapons might be hung on temple walls, their foreign designs displayed not only as symbols of triumph but as sacred gifts. The gods had favored Rome, and Rome repaid them with the spoils of war. In this way, even the tools of slaughter were transformed into religious artifacts, proof that the empire's victories were woven into the fabric of divine destiny. There were darker elements too. In some instances, enemy leaders, captured alive, were paraded in triumphs and then executed as offerings to the gods of war. Their deaths were not just punishment, but ritual sacrifices meant to mark the victory as complete, the balance fully restored. Even here, Rome blurred the line between religion and politics, faith and propaganda. To the watching crowds, it was not just vengeance, it was divine justice enacted before their eyes. The importance of cleansing cannot be overstated. Rome feared what they called contagion of death. Just as rot could spread in flesh, so too could spiritual corruption spread through a community. The lust ratio was their shield against this invisible enemy. Without it, victory might sour into misfortune. Crops might fail, legions might mutiny, and omens might darken the skies. With it, order was restored. Picture the scene: thousands of men standing in rigid formation, their armor still dented from battle, their faces smeared with dirt and smoke. Before them, priests chant in Latin, their voices rising over the crackle of sacrificial fires. The scent of burning flesh and incense mingles with the wind. As the final prayer is spoken, a hush falls over the army. Then the command is given, and the men march forward, through smoke and flame, cleansed of death's stain. Behind them lies a battlefield of graves and ashes. Ahead of them lies Rome, waiting for her sons to return purified, worthy once more to step within her walls. For the legionary, the ritual meant safety, dignity, and spiritual renewal. For the commander, it meant legitimacy and political capital. For Rome itself, it meant continuity, the assurance that the empire was in harmony with the gods. War was never just a human endeavor. It was a sacred drama, and every act, from the first clash of swords to the final sacrifice, had to be performed with precision. The Romans believed they did not conquer alone. They conquered with Jupiter's blessing, with Mars' strength, with the favor of victory herself. And so, when the last fire burned out and the army set its gaze forward, they did so not as men weighed down by slaughter but as soldiers renewed, armored not only in steel but in divine approval. The purification was complete. The empire could march on. When the battlefield was cleansed, when the dead were buried and the army purified, there remained one last act in the Roman drama of war. For the most successful commanders, it was the pinnacle of their careers, the moment when private victory became public spectacle, when personal ambition fused with Rome's eternal image. This was the triumph. A triumph was not granted lightly. It required the Senate's approval, and only the most extraordinary victories qualified. The conditions were strict: the enemy had to be foreign, not Roman rebels, the campaign had to be concluded, the commander had to have held supreme command. When all these boxes were checked, and when political winds favored him, a general was awarded the honor of leading a triumphal procession into Rome. The day of the triumph was unlike any other. The city stirred long before dawn. Citizens lined the streets, eager to see the conqueror return. Vendors sold laurel wreaths, incense burned in preparation, and the air carried a hum of expectation. For ordinary Romans, the triumph was a holiday, a chance to bask in the glory of empire, to be reminded of Rome's invincibility. Then the procession began. At its head marched prisoners of war, chains clinking as they stumbled through the streets. These were not nameless captives, they were often enemy leaders, kings, or generals, paraded for all to see. Some would be executed later, offered as sacrifices to the gods. Others would languish in Roman prisons until death. Their humiliation was the empire's first display of dominance. Behind them rolled wagons laden with treasure. Gold, silver, weapons, and statues, all taken from the conquered lands, gleamed in the sunlight. Exotic animals sometimes followed: elephants from Africa, tigers from the east, bears from the forests of the north. Each prize was proof that Rome's reach extended to the ends of the known world. The citizens roared as the wealth of foreign nations passed before their eyes. Then came the standards and trophies of war. Banners seized from enemy armies, shields and swords collected from battlefields, and sacred objects torn from enemy temples, all carried aloft. To see them was to witness the stripping away of another people's power, their gods now subject to Rome's. Every object was a symbol, each one a reminder that Rome had not only defeated its enemies but absorbed their strength. And then, the heart of the triumph, the victorious general himself. He rode in a 4-horse chariot, dressed in a purple toga embroidered with gold, the garment of kings and gods. On his head rested a laurel crown, and in his hand he held a scepter. For this single day, he was allowed to embody Jupiter, the king of the gods. The crowd erupted in cheers as he passed, hailing him as the savior of Rome. Yet even in this moment of exaltation, humility was imposed. Behind the general stood a slave, holding a golden crown above his head and whispering into his ear, "Remember, you are mortal." The message was clear. No matter the glory, no matter the godlike appearance, the general was still a man, subject to death, subject to Rome. The triumph elevated him, but it also reminded him that his fame belonged not to himself, but to the empire. Following the general marched his soldiers, the legionaries who had carried him to victory. They sang songs, sometimes mocking, sometimes bawdy, about their commander. These chants were tolerated, even encouraged, as they showed that Rome's victories were not just the work of one man but the labor of many. The soldiers bore laurel branches, their armor polished, their ranks precise. They were the living proof of Rome's power, a reminder that discipline and unity had built the empire more securely than any single act of bravery. The procession wound its way to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. There, sacrifices were offered. The general laid his laurel crown on Jupiter's lap, dedicating his victory to the god who had supposedly guided Rome's destiny. What had begun on the battlefield in blood and fire now ended in smoke and prayer. The cycle was complete, victory had been sanctified, dedicated, and made eternal. But the triumph was more than religion. It was politics, pure and powerful. To the citizens, it was proof that their empire was unmatched, that their sons' sacrifices had not been in vain. To the Senate, it was a reminder of Rome's dominion. To the general, it was immortality. His name would be carved into monuments, his deeds sung in poems, his triumph recorded in the annals of history. No man could hope for greater glory. Still, not every commander received such honors. Many victories went uncelebrated, their generals denied the purple toga. But even without triumphs, smaller monuments and dedications preserved their legacies. Weapons were displayed in temples, inscriptions marked the sites of battles, and offerings reminded the people that every Roman victory, whether or not paraded in Rome, was part of the empire's larger story. For the soldiers, the triumph was more than a spectacle. It was a reminder that their blood had purchased not only territory but glory. Watching their general hailed as a god for a day, they knew that their service had built the empire's greatness. The songs they sang, the spoils they carried, the chains that bound their enemies, all of it was a reflection of their discipline and sacrifice. In the end, the triumph encapsulated everything Rome believed about war. It was not chaos. It was order. It was not simply killing, it was transformation. The battlefield, once a place of carnage, became a procession of glory. Death was turned into spectacle, sacrifice into memory, conquest into eternal legacy. The triumph told Romans that their empire was not only powerful but destined, chosen by the gods themselves to rule the world. And when the cheering crowds dispersed, when the laurel crowns were laid aside and the generals returned to their villas, the work of Rome continued. Engineers rebuilt, soldiers marched to new frontiers, priests prepared for the next cleansing rites. War never truly ended. Each triumph was both an ending and a beginning, a reminder that Rome's battle was not just against flesh and blood, but against the chaos of history itself. Through burial, purification, and triumph, the Romans ensured that nothing was left unfinished. The dead were given dignity or disgrace as Rome chose. The living were cleansed of death's stain. And the victors were elevated, if only for a day, into the realm of gods. Even in their celebrations, the empire's obsession with order shone through. For Rome, war was never merely survival or conquest. It was civilization itself, imposed with sword, with ritual, and with spectacle. In this way, the triumph was more than a parade. It was Rome declaring to itself, and to the world, we do not simply win. We endure. We shape death into order. We turn chaos into memory. And in doing so, we make our empire eternal.